Either many of America's most senior leaders are willfully deceiving us, or they have remarkably bad judgment. I'm not sure which the answer is right now. We're going to delve into that a little bit in this episode here. But no matter what the answer turns out to be, this is bad for America and something that you need to be aware of, especially when you hear these kind of comments coming from folks in the future. You need to understand what's behind them. Now, I'm coming at this from quite a ways back. It's just not a new thing for me to be addressing deception among some of our senior leaders. And I got into this, I guess, the first time really, at least in the public eye, in 2012. In October of 2010, I deployed into Afghanistan for what would be my fourth combat deployment and final one in Afghanistan, and had seen with my own eyes just the big gulf between what the senior leaders had said and what was really going on the ground. And I was so morally troubled by it, because I knew that men were dying because of this deception that was going on, that I felt an obligation to have to say something in public. So when I came back, I wrote an article which was then picked up by the New York Times, and well, here's what happened.
Next to Afghanistan, where an officer serving in the U.S. Army has openly criticized top brass for misleading Congress and the American people about the war. Margaret Warner has our story.
As the war in Afghanistan continues into its 11th year, top U.S. military officials have repeatedly said that progress has been made in arresting the Taliban's drive and moving to Afghan self-sufficiency. But recently, an Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, has made waves charging that is simply not the case. In a classified report to Congress and an 84-page unclassified version, Davis accuses the military's top brass of misleading the American public about just how badly the war is going. He draws on 250 interviews he did with U.S. troops and Afghans during a year-long mission throughout the country last year. Among those in his sights, General David Petraeus, who commanded troops in Afghanistan before becoming CIA director, and statements of his like this testimony last March.
The momentum achieved by the Taliban in Afghanistan since 2005 has been arrested in much of the country and reversed in a number of important areas.
Lieutenant Colonel Davis has briefed members of Congress and staff and spoke with us this morning. Colonel Davis, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
You charge in this lengthy report and also in your article that not only is the war in Afghanistan failing, but that the senior military leadership has used what you call omission and outright deception in order to prevent the American public from knowing the truth. That's a very serious charge. What's your evidence that it's actual deception?
Well, when you have a certain amount of information that you know things are a certain way, and then you convey them in public in a way that contradicts that, that's hard to get by with, to say that that's not intentional or knowing that we're trying to make you think something that's not so.
Into that, well, you have the physical evidence on the ground. In August of 2021, as is now quite famous, infamous, we did in fact lose that war. I had started writing in 2009 and 2010 in the Armed Forces Journal. I had written that unless we made some significant changes, we were going to lose the war. Now, at the time, people just kind of rolled their eyes about that, because of the idea that, what, the United States is going to lose to a bunch of guys in what they used to say, bed sheets and flip-flops with guns in their hands? That's never going to happen. But yet I saw that the fundamentals, aside from the spin and aside from the emotions that were involved, the fundamentals said that if you don't make some changes, you're heading in a direction that'll end up in defeat. And that's exactly how it happened. But then I saw the senior leaders on the ground telling the American public the exact opposite. And they said all the way up until the very end that, no, this was going well, that we're making progress and everything's going better. And it never was. And then finally, the spin was finally overcome by reality in the catastrophic collapse of everything in Afghanistan. And to this day, now then, the Taliban are still in power there. So we knew that that was bad. And again, this is not really to say that I'm some kind of really excellent, can peer into the issues and see something that other people can't. The thing is, these things are not hard to see. If you're willing to look at it with an honest eye and say, here are the facts, here's the reality on the ground. Historically, this is what has happened. Here's how these things actually impact on combat operations in the future or in the present. and this is what's likely in the future. You can say those things. They're not hard, especially big, gross things like that. So what I said was evident to many people, and I wasn't the only one that was saying it. I'll point that out. There was many that did. None of them were listened to because they didn't have any power. Those that were listened to were like of the class of David Petraeus, who then went on to become CIA director. And we know where that went from there too. But you see that even though you were catastrophically wrong, you said things that were not true, yet you get rewarded and you moved on. Now, in this current war in Ukraine, I started off in a similar fashion. In the months leading up to this, I warned repeatedly that Putin was given very clear signals that he intended to invade Ukraine if NATO was not taken off the table. And he continued to say that, especially in December and in January of 2022. He kept saying those things over and over. No one was listening. And so then the war breaks out on the 24th of February. The next day, I went on Fox News and explained how I saw the situation.
The biggest reason why I'd been saying so many times here on Fox, even in recent weeks and months, that we should have taken the opportunity before the first bullet was fired to come to a negotiated settlement where we recognize ground truth reality that Ukraine cannot defend itself effectively from Russia. And we should have just acknowledged that they'll never be allowed into NATO. Had we done that, had Zelensky recognized that NATO was never coming to his aid, then they should have been willing to negotiate and say, we're not going to join NATO. They didn't do that. And now then you have the expected result, which Putin was very clear to signal. And so now that there's no one coming to his aid, there's no, magic package of weapons and armaments that are going to change what's going on here. It just doesn't work that way. Combat doesn't work where you just throw a bunch of weapons in under fire and think that's going to have any possible impact on the outcome. It won't. Is at least reported in British media a couple of hours ago to have said that he is willing now to discuss neutrality. Now, of course, I argue he should have done that before, but that's probably the one thing that can still stop this war. Sanctions, threats from us aren't going to do it. But in response, Peskov from Moscow said that the Russians are willing to discuss that. They are willing to contemplate that if it's a serious offer.
And of course, it turned out to not be a serious offer because many people in the West and certainly in Ukraine also said, hey, no, let's just keep fighting. And I think as we talked about on our episode with John Mearsheimer recently, there was a even more serious negotiation possibility to end the war in March and April of that year, which could have shut things down right then with the deal that largely was available prior to the war that should have been taken. But again, our people keep saying, our leaders keep saying, no, we're going to support Ukraine no matter what. And now then we see the expected result. Now, I said on the second day of the war, the fundamentals were not on Ukraine's side. Now, I, along with many others, did overestimate what Russia could do at the beginning. I wrote a series of articles explaining why that was, because Russia projected that they had done the things necessary to provide or to create a quality armed forces and combined arms operations force that could do those things. And they failed pretty spectacularly, both tactically and strategically. But, and here's the critical point that was true then, and it's true now. Russia is big enough that it could absorb those mistakes, overcome them, and still continue to win. So the balance of power between the two, even with Russia's egregious missteps in those first 6 months of the war, is still in Russia's favor. But now that it's growing incredibly stronger by the month in Russia's favor. So there's no reason to think that the war is going to turn out different now. Now, heading into the summer offensive this year, again, I was going month after month, writing articles saying, hey, look, the war, it's not going to work. Ukraine doesn't have the fundamentals. They don't have the air power. They don't have the air defense. They don't have the mine clearing capabilities, and they don't have the experience. Even though they may have a lot of armor, it's a hodgepodge of things. And none of those things say that you're going to be able to defeat a dug-in infantry fighting force with mechanized power that does have air power, that does have minefields and has air defense capabilities. All those things, artillery shells, almost without limit. There's no reason to think that should have won. And on May 31st, before this offensive launched, I went on NBC News, I think it was, and said this.
everyone knows they don't have the capacity of this one offensive to drive Russia out of Ukraine. That's not even possible. But they do have to have some degree of success. And it's really difficult to say what that is. But if they try to launch this, for example, when they tried to flank Bakhmut about 10 days ago, they tried to cut it off and go deep into the flanks, but did not take even one city on either side, and it stalled out. That they can't afford again, because if that does happen, I think there really will be a lot of pressure among Europe to say, hey, this is not going to work. You're going to have to make a negotiated settlement. And then I think that the weapons are going to start drying up.
And that's pretty much how it worked out. The offensive completely foundered, didn't succeed at all for the reasons that I laid out before the thing even happened. And now there is a big issue with the funds drying up, as we talked about earlier in our show today. And you see on Capitol Hill right now, the Congress is not eager to give more money because they see that the last $100 billion didn't do anything. And so now why should they go on? But you have some other senior leaders in the United States that didn't quite see it that way. And so again, we have to ask the question, is this an intentional deception to try to convince the American people to do something that doesn't make any sense? Or do they just have bad judgment? I'm not sure, but here's what David Petraeus went on the BBC to say within just days of when I went on May 31st.
I believe that we'll see for the first time in this war on either side the achievement of true combined arms effects. In other words, the results of tanks protected by infantry against anti-tank guided missiles, artillery and mortars keeping the enemy's heads down, engineers reducing the obstacles, breaching these fortifications that the Russians have established, air defense keeping the Russians off the Ukrainians, electronic warfare jamming the Russians' already inadequate command and control facilities, and all orchestrated by very, very good Ukrainian command and control, and also using drones out over the Russians to attack them in depth with the precision munitions that the U.S. and U.K. and others have provided. And noting that on the Russian side, this is a force that has been battered, that many of these units have been in constant combat for well over a year. They're not pulling units offline and reconstituting them, in other words, replacing the losses, the people, the equipment, and retraining them. They're just adding people to the front lines. That's not the way you produce a cohesive, coherent, well-disciplined organization. And I think, therefore, that's why they're going to crack, crumble, and perhaps actually collapse.
Perhaps actually collapse. That still just rings in my ear that he was saying that he lauded the Ukraine side so much, talking like they were going to be this modern combined arms operation force, which he detailed what they were going to do, and then that the Russians are terrible and they're going to crumble and probably collapse, and neither one of those things happened. And in fact, now that those lines never moved. And again, we've talked about this in great deal depth on many of our previous shows. None of those things happened. So there is now even less prospect for a Ukraine military victory than there has ever been before. And yet, in just the last 24, 48 hours, you have other American senior leaders saying things that are just nonsense. Here we have a former 3-star general who was the commander of all U.S. Army forces in Europe, a 3-star general, somebody who should have much more knowledge than some lieutenant colonel. But yet, here's what he says.
Ukraine has not failed. I think we in the West have failed. We failed to commit strategically to Ukraine winning, and therefore we have failed to deliver those capabilities that Ukraine needs and has expected. But also just the psychological aspect. We have not said we want Ukraine to win.
I mean, what is he basing that off of? That we haven't done everything we can to win. We've given 5,000 armored vehicles. We've given hundreds of billions of dollars, and maybe even 60 billion more, millions of shells, training, intelligence support. Obviously, that's nonsense what he's saying. But even more fundamentally than that, Ukraine isn't winning for the fundamental reasons. They don't have the capacity to do it. And yet he's just saying, oh, it's America's fault because we didn't give them enough stuff. We needed to give them more stuff. And somehow that would have worked. And as I keep telling people over and over, wars are won with men, not machines. Giving them a few more missiles and a few more tanks or whatever else he may have had in mind would not have changed the outcome at all, as is self-evident by looking at the ground because of all the things they have gotten from many countries, not just the United States. And now then the administration, I don't know if they're just unwilling to acknowledge the truth or they just don't have good judgment. I'm not sure. But you have John Kirby, I think it was just yesterday, saying that, man, now there's a new reason why we need to keep fighting the war, not just so they can win, but, well, I'll let him talk for himself.
If Mr. Putin gets his way, he hasn't changed his mind. He still wants to take Ukraine and wipe it off the map. That puts him right up against the eastern flank of NATO. And who's to say that he won't make a move on a NATO nation? He's already threatened some NATO nations with aggressive rhetoric. It's entirely possible that we could then be involved in a larger war in the European continent, with American troops having to be involved because of our Article 5 commitments to defend our NATO allies. That's how serious this can get.
Now he's just talking fear mongering. Now there's no more facts to talk about. So now he's talking about things that may happen in the future. And my God, Russia may roll all the way into NATO and into the Western Europe. And then Article 5 is going to have us, and then we'll be fighting a war. My God, we have to keep giving them support now so that they can, avoid Armageddon. But that is complete nonsense. That Russia, as I keep pointing out graphically, doesn't even have the capacity to go and attack a 32-member military alliance. They have no interest in doing it, and they have no capacity to do it. Even if they wanted to, they can't. So that part is just patently inaccurate. Now, whether that's a lie or deception, I don't have the ability to know. But no matter which of those things it is, it's troubling, because what the administration should do is see all these things laid out, see all the truth and all the graphic evidence that we keep talking about here on Deep Dive, and say, putting more money into it's not going to change the outcome. The Ukraine has lost too many men, and they don't have the training and the knowledge, and Russia is getting stronger. There is no rational path that we should say more money or time is going to help Ukraine. So what we should be doing is saying, let's help them hold what they got as best we can, and then press for a diplomatic and negotiated solution. That's the one thing that has a legitimate shot. Even that's going to be hard, but at least it's a legitimate reason we could do it. It's a legitimate shot, but we're not doing that. Instead, we're continuing to tell the American people things that aren't true. We're reporting things that are not accurate, leading us in a direction that can't succeed. Folks, that's why I'm telling you, this is an important issue. It's not like, oh, they're just not telling us the truth. That's what people do. You come to expect it. That's not the issue anymore. It's way beyond that. There are very practical things involved here. We should not give one more dollar to Ukraine unless there is an identifiable strategy that's attached that can succeed, and not just because we want to, or that's what we've been doing for 22 months and we're going to do it more. It's time to change that. It's time to start doing things that make sense. It's time to start being honest and open with the American people. We're going to continue to track this for you, and we're going to give you all the updates as they happen. But folks, you need the truth, and this is where you're going to get it. Now, we ask you to like and subscribe and pass this on to your friends, because everybody needs to know what I'm telling you here, because you're not hearing this one on these other networks. When you see like Hodges and Kirby and all these other people are quoted, no context is given. People aren't talking about this stuff. They need to know, so do you. And we're going to keep being unintimidated and uncompromised and giving you the truth, because that's what we're here for. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.